New York City, 1952. A young psychiatrist named Arthur Sackler was working at Crescent Publishing. It was not a prestigious job. Crescent published medical journals, low circulation, modest advertising revenue, boring. But Arthur Sackler saw something that nobody else saw. He saw that doctors were the gatekeepers to billions of dollars in pharmaceutical sales. And he realized that if you could control what doctors prescribed, you could print money. Arthur Sackler did not just work at Crescent Publishing, he also had a private practice. And he consulted for pharmaceutical companies, and he owned an advertising agency called Medical and Pharmaceutical Marketing Associates. This was a conflict of interest, a massive one. But in the 1950s, nobody cared. There were no rules against it. A doctor could publish journals, write articles, consult for drug companies, and advertise their products all at the same time. And Arthur Sackler did all of it. His breakthrough came with a drug called Valium. Valium was a tranquilizer made by Hoffmann La Roche. It was introduced in 1963. Before Sackler got involved, Valium was marketed conservatively, for severe anxiety, for hospital use, limited prescriptions. But Sackler saw a bigger market. He saw that if you could convince doctors that anxiety was a widespread problem and that Valium was the solution, you could sell it to millions of people. He created the first modern pharmaceutical marketing campaign. He did not advertise to patients. That was illegal. He advertised to doctors. He bought full-page ads in medical journals showing happy families, productive workers, people living normal lives thanks to Valium. He paid doctors to give lectures about anxiety disorders at medical conferences. All expenses paid, nice hotels, good food, and a fee for their time. The lectures always concluded that Valium was the best treatment. He hired sales representatives to visit doctors' offices. The reps were attractive, well-dressed. They brought free samples. They brought studies showing Valium was safe and effective. They brought gifts, pens, notepads, clocks with the Valium logo. Small things, but doctors remembered them. And when a patient came in complaining about stress or trouble sleeping, the doctor reached for the Valium prescription pad. By 1978, Valium was the most prescribed drug in America. 2.3 billion pills sold that year. Doctors were writing Valium prescriptions for everything: stress, insomnia, back pain, nervousness before a flight, marital problems. It became a cultural phenomenon. Magazines called it Mother's Little Helper. The Rolling Stones wrote a song about it. Everyone knew someone taking Valium, but there was a problem. Valium was addictive, horribly addictive. Patients who took it for a few weeks found they could not stop. If they tried to quit, they experienced withdrawal, anxiety, tremors, seizures, in some cases, death. The medical community started to realize that they had created millions of addicts. By the early 1980s, Valium prescriptions began to decline. Doctors became more cautious. Regulators started paying attention. Arthur Sackler never faced consequences for the Valium epidemic. He made a fortune. His advertising agency became one of the most successful in the pharmaceutical industry. He used the money to buy art. He donated to museums. The Smithsonian has a Sackler gallery. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has a Sackler wing. He became a philanthropist, a respected member of society. When he died in 1987, the obituaries praised his contributions to medicine and culture. They did not mention the addiction. But Arthur Sackler's real legacy was not art galleries. It was a business model, a blueprint for how to sell addictive drugs legally. And his brothers Mortimer and Raymond were paying attention. In 1952, the three Sackler brothers bought a small pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma. It was based in Connecticut. It made earwax remover and laxatives, nothing exciting. For decades, it stayed small. But in 1987, Arthur died. And Mortimer and Raymond, who now controlled Purdue, decided it was time to build their own empire. They wanted a blockbuster drug, something that would make them as rich as Arthur had been. They wanted their own Valium. In 1984, Purdue had acquired the rights to a painkiller called OxyContin. It was a timed-release morphine tablet, designed for cancer patients in severe pain. It worked by releasing morphine slowly over 12 hours. This was useful because cancer patients needed constant pain relief without having to take pills every few hours. OxyContin was a good drug for a specific purpose, but it was a small market. Cancer patients, terminal illness, hospice care. limited sales. The Sacklers wanted more. They started asking their research team, can we make a stronger version? Can we use a different opioid? Can we market it more broadly? The researchers came back with oxycodone. Oxycodone is a semi-synthetic opioid, stronger than morphine by weight, more euphoric, more addictive. But with the same timed-release mechanism, it could theoretically provide 12 hours of pain relief. Purdue developed the drug and called it OxyContin. Oxy for oxycodone, Contin for continuous release. The pill came in different strengths, 10 milligrams, 20, 40, 80, 160. The higher doses were extraordinarily powerful. A single 80-milligram OxyContin pill contained more opioid than most people would need after major surgery. But Purdue was not planning to market OxyContin just for cancer or post-surgical pain. They were planning to market it for everything. In the early 1990s, there was a movement in medicine called the pain management revolution. Doctors were being told that pain was undertreated, that patients suffered unnecessarily because doctors were too afraid of prescribing opioids. Advocacy groups, many funded by pharmaceutical companies, argued that opioids were safe for long-term use if prescribed correctly. That addiction was rare if patients were really in pain. This was not true, but it was being taught at medical schools, printed in medical journals, presented at conferences. Purdue saw an opportunity. They positioned OxyContin as the solution to undertreated pain. They claimed it was less addictive than other opioids because of the timed-release formula. The idea was that because the drug was released slowly, it would not create the sudden high that caused addiction. This sounded plausible, but it was based on almost no evidence. One study, a 5-sentence letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine, that was it. No clinical trials, no long-term data, just a theory. But Purdue did not let the lack of evidence stop them. They submitted OxyContin to the FDA for approval in 1995. The FDA reviewer was a doctor named Curtis Wright. The approval process normally took years, especially for a powerful opioid. But Wright fast-tracked it. OxyContin was approved in December 1995, just 6 months after submission, and the label included a remarkable claim. Delayed absorption, as provided by OxyContin tablets, is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. This label language was a goldmine. It allowed Purdue to tell doctors that OxyContin was safer than other opioids, less likely to be abused. The FDA had essentially endorsed that claim by allowing it on the label. Purdue's sales team would wave that label in doctors' faces for the next decade. And here is where it gets worse. In 1998, Curtis Wright left the FDA and joined Purdue Pharma as an executive, making over $400,000 per year. The man who approved OxyContin was now working for the company that made it. This was legal. The revolving door between the FDA and pharmaceutical companies was common, but it stank. It looked like a payoff, and it probably was. With FDA approval in hand, Purdue launched the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaign in history. They hired an army of sales representatives, over 1,000 reps by 2001, more than twice the industry average for a single drug. These reps were trained to target primary care doctors, not specialists, not pain management experts, family doctors, general practitioners, the doctors who saw the most patients and wrote the most prescriptions. The reps were given bonuses based on the number of prescriptions and the dosage strength. If a doctor prescribed high-dose OxyContin, the rep made more money. If a doctor prescribed a lot of OxyContin, the rep made more money. The incentive structure was designed to push higher doses and more pills. Purdue paid out over $40 million in bonuses to sales reps between 1996 and 2001. The sales pitch was simple. OxyContin provides 12 hours of pain relief. Patients only need 2 pills per day. It is less addictive than other opioids. It is safe for chronic pain, back pain, arthritis, fibromyalgia, any kind of ongoing pain. The reps brought studies, glossy brochures, videos of smiling patients, free samples, lots of free samples. Doctors could hand them out like candy. Purdue also paid doctors to attend pain management seminars. All expense-paid trips to resort locations, Arizona, Florida, California. The doctors would sit through a few hours of lectures about pain treatment, always concluding that opioids were safe and underused. Then they would golf, eat expensive dinners, relax by the pool, and go home with a check for their time. Between 1996 and 2002, Purdue spent over $200 million on these programs. It worked. OxyContin sales exploded. In 1996, the first year, Purdue made $45 million from OxyContin. By 2000, it was over $1 billion. By 2010, over $3 billion per year. OxyContin became one of the best-selling drugs in America. Doctors were prescribing it for everything. A twisted ankle, a tooth extraction, lower back pain. Patients who had never taken an opioid in their lives were being sent home with a month's supply of one of the most powerful painkillers ever made. And people started dying. Not immediately, not in 1996, but by the early 2000s, emergency rooms were seeing a spike in overdoses. Opioid-related deaths were increasing. Families were burying sons and daughters who had started with a prescription and ended up addicted. Small towns in rural America were being devastated. Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Places where jobs had disappeared and pain was everywhere. Physical pain from hard labor. Emotional pain from economic collapse. OxyContin filled both voids. But the deaths were just beginning. Because people discovered something that Purdue did not advertise. OxyContin pills could be crushed. And when you crushed the timed-release coating, you released all of the oxycodone at once. 12 hours of medication in one instant hit. You could snort the powder or dissolve it in water and inject it. And the high was incredible. Stronger than heroin, cleaner, more reliable. Because it came from a pharmacy, not a street dealer, users knew exactly what they were getting. Pharmaceutical-grade opioid, made in America. Purdue knew about this almost immediately. By 1997, they were receiving reports from sales reps that pills were being crushed and snorted. By 2000, there were news stories about OxyContin abuse. The drug was being called hillbilly heroin. Pharmacies in rural areas were being robbed. People were doctor shopping, going to multiple physicians to get multiple prescriptions. The black market price for an 80-milligram pill was $80, more expensive than heroin. Internal Purdue documents, later revealed in lawsuits, show that executives knew the problem was widespread. But they did not pull the drug. They did not change the formula. They did not stop the aggressive marketing. Instead, they blamed the patients. Purdue's official position was that abuse was the fault of addicts and criminals, not the company. They said that people who took OxyContin as prescribed did not get addicted. This was a lie. But it allowed them to keep selling. The Sackler family was intimately involved in all of this. This was not a case of absentee owners unaware of what their company was doing. Richard Sackler, son of Raymond, was on the board of directors. He became president of Purdue in 1999. Internal emails and documents show that he personally directed marketing strategy. He pushed for higher sales targets. He celebrated when OxyContin reached blockbuster status. In 2001, Richard Sackler gave a speech at a company event launching a new marketing campaign. He said, and this is a direct quote from a recording, "We have to hammer on abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals." Think about that. The president of the company that made OxyContin, that marketed it aggressively, that paid doctors to prescribe it, that knew it was being abused, was calling the victims criminals. People who had trusted their doctors, who had taken the medication as prescribed and gotten addicted, who were now suffering, and the billionaire who profited from their addiction, was calling them reckless criminals. By 2007, the evidence of Purdue's wrongdoing was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors had been building a case. They had internal documents, whistleblower testimony from former employees, statistical data showing that Purdue knew about the abuse and did nothing. The company was facing serious criminal charges. In May 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to a felony, misbranding OxyContin with intent to defraud and mislead. The company admitted that it had falsely claimed OxyContin was less addictive and less subject to abuse than other opioids. They admitted that they had trained sales reps to make false statements to doctors. The company agreed to pay $634 million in fines and penalties. $634 million sounds like a lot. But by 2007, Purdue had made over $35 billion from OxyContin. The fine was less than 2% of their total revenue. It was a rounding error, a cost of doing business. And here is the truly infuriating part. No member of the Sackler family was criminally charged. Not Richard, not the other board members. Nobody went to jail. 3 Purdue executives pleaded guilty to misdemeanors and paid fines. They did not serve a single day in prison. The Sackler family issued a statement expressing regret. They said they took responsibility, but they did not stop. OxyContin sales continued. Purdue continued marketing aggressively. The epidemic got worse. By 2010, the opioid epidemic was undeniable. Emergency rooms across America were overwhelmed. Overdose deaths were skyrocketing. In 2000, there were about 17,000 opioid-related deaths in the United States. By 2010, it was over 38,000. And the numbers kept climbing. Purdue's response was not to pull OxyContin from the market. It was not to stop marketing. It was to expand. They started targeting new populations, elderly patients, veterans, people with chronic conditions like diabetes, which often causes nerve pain. They developed new formulations, OxyContin for children. Yes, children. In 2015, the FDA approved OxyContin for pediatric use in patients as young as 11 years old. But the real problem was that Purdue's patents were expiring. Generic oxycodone was entering the market. Competition was cutting into profits. The Sackler family needed a new strategy, and they found one: extraction. Between 2008 and 2018, the Sackler family withdrew more than $11 billion from Purdue Pharma. $11 billion. They moved the money into offshore accounts, family trusts, real estate, art collections. They were draining the company of cash, preparing for what they knew was coming, because lawsuits were piling up. By 2015, hundreds of cities, counties, and states were suing Purdue. Families of overdose victims were suing. The legal costs were mounting. And the Sacklers knew that eventually Purdue would face a reckoning. So they took the money out. They made sure that even if Purdue went bankrupt, the family fortune would be safe. Internal emails, later obtained through discovery and lawsuits, show that family members were explicitly discussing how to protect their wealth. In one email from 2014, a Sackler family member wrote about the need to distribute the funds before litigation got worse. In another, they discussed moving money to offshore trusts that would be harder to reach in bankruptcy proceedings. This was not panicked decision-making. This was calculated asset protection. The Sacklers hired some of the best lawyers and financial advisors in the world. They structured their wealth in ways that would make it nearly impossible for victims to collect damages. And it worked. While the Sacklers were extracting billions, the epidemic was mutating. OxyContin had opened the door to opioid addiction for millions of Americans. But OxyContin was expensive. On the street, $80 for a single pill. Many addicts could not afford it, so they switched to heroin. Heroin was cheaper, $10 to $20 for a dose, and it was everywhere. Mexican drug cartels saw the demand and flooded the United States with heroin. The DEA estimates that heroin production in Mexico increased by over 500% between 2005 and 2015. The cartels were literally responding to a market that Purdue Pharma had created. People who had never used illegal drugs in their lives, who had started with a prescription from a trusted doctor, but were now buying heroin from dealers. The progression was predictable. Start with OxyContin prescribed for pain. Develop tolerance, need higher doses, run out of prescription, cannot afford more pills, switch to heroin, overdose. This pattern played out hundreds of thousands of times across America, and then it got worse. Around 2013, fentanyl started appearing in the heroin supply. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine. It is so potent that a dose the size of a few grains of salt can kill. Drug dealers started mixing fentanyl into heroin because it was cheap to produce and increased potency. But they often mixed it unevenly. One bag might have almost no fentanyl. The next might be pure fentanyl. Users had no way to know. They injected what they thought was their normal dose and died within seconds. Fentanyl overdoses exploded. In 2010, there were about 3,000 fentanyl-related deaths in the United States. By 2020, there were over 56,000. And the deaths were not just addicts anymore. They were people who had never used opioids, teenagers who tried a pill at a party and did not know it was fentanyl. College students who bought what they thought was Xanax or Adderall online. The pills were counterfeit, pressed with fentanyl. One pill killed them. The connection to Purdue is direct. Studies have shown that states with the highest OxyContin prescription rates in the 2000s had the highest heroin and fentanyl death rates in the 2010s. Purdue created the market. The cartels filled it, and fentanyl made it lethal. By 2017, opioid overdoses were killing more Americans than car accidents, more than guns. It was a public health catastrophe on a scale not seen since the AIDS epidemic, and unlike AIDS, this epidemic was entirely man-made, created by a pharmaceutical company, enabled by doctors, protected by regulators, and profited from by one family. The Sacklers, meanwhile, were living like royalty. They owned mansions in New York, Connecticut, London, and the French Riviera. They collected art worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They sat on the boards of museums and universities, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Guggenheim, Yale. They were philanthropists. Their names were on buildings, but the walls were closing in. In 2017, the state of Massachusetts filed a lawsuit against Purdue and 16 members of the Sackler family personally. This was significant. Most lawsuits targeted only the company. But Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey went after the family. She argued that they were not passive owners. They were active participants. They directed the marketing. They knew about the deaths. They extracted billions while the company went bankrupt. They were liable. The Massachusetts lawsuit included devastating evidence, internal emails, meeting minutes, financial records. One email from Richard Sackler suggested that Purdue should blame overdose deaths on the abusers and argue that the problem was criminal behavior, not the drug. Another email discussed whether to keep marketing OxyContin in states with high overdose rates or to focus on states with lower death tolls. They chose to keep marketing everywhere. Other states followed Massachusetts. By 2019, over 2,000 lawsuits had been filed against Purdue and the Sacklers. The legal pressure was unsustainable. Purdue could not fight them all. So in September 2019, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Bankruptcy sounds like defeat, but for the Sacklers, it was a strategic move. Here is how bankruptcy works for the rich. When a company files for Chapter 11, all lawsuits are frozen. Creditors and claimants cannot pursue the company in court. Instead, a bankruptcy plan is negotiated. The company offers a settlement. Creditors vote on whether to accept it. If the plan is approved, the company is reorganized or liquidated, and the debts are settled. What it does not do is touch the owner's personal wealth. Unless the owners are also sued personally, their money is safe. The Sacklers offered a deal. Purdue would dissolve. The company would be turned into a public benefit corporation that would produce addiction treatment medications and donate profits to communities affected by the opioid crisis. Sounds noble, right? But here is the catch. In exchange for this, the Sackler family demanded full immunity from all current and future civil lawsuits. They would pay $4.5 billion into a settlement fund. But they would never admit wrongdoing. They would never face criminal charges, and they would keep the remaining $7 billion they had already extracted. Victims' families were outraged. $4.5 billion sounds like a lot, but it was less than half of what the family had taken. And it would be divided among hundreds of thousands of claimants. Each victim's family would get maybe a few $1,000s. Meanwhile, the Sacklers would remain billionaires. Many states rejected the deal. They argued that the Sacklers should not be allowed to buy immunity, that bankruptcy law was being abused, that the family should face criminal prosecution. But other states, desperate for money to fund addiction treatment programs, supported the settlement. The negotiations dragged on for years. In 2021, a bankruptcy judge approved a modified version of the deal. The Sacklers would pay $6 billion instead of $4.5 billion. Still not the full $11 billion they took, but more than the original offer. In exchange, they would receive immunity from civil liability. They could never be sued for their role in the opioid epidemic. The decision was controversial. Victims' advocates called it a travesty. Legal experts debated whether bankruptcy law should allow this kind of immunity for people who were not themselves bankrupt. In 2024, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a challenge to the bankruptcy plan. The question was whether non-debtors, meaning the Sacklers, could receive legal immunity through someone else's bankruptcy. It was a narrow legal issue, but it had enormous implications. If the court struck down the deal, the Sacklers could face billions in additional liability. If it upheld the deal, it would set a precedent allowing wealthy families to use corporate bankruptcy as a shield. While the legal battle continued, the deaths continued. In 2022, over 107,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. Most were opioid-related. Fentanyl was now in everything, not just heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, counterfeit pills. The epidemic had spread beyond the opioid-addicted population. It was killing casual users, first-time experimenters, people who thought they were taking a painkiller and were actually taking poison. The total death toll from the opioid epidemic is now estimated at over 600,000 Americans since 1999. 600,000. That is more than the entire population of Washington, D.C. More than died in the Civil War. More than died in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. And it is still happening. The economic cost is incalculable. Lost productivity, medical expenses, addiction treatment, foster care for children whose parents overdosed, criminal justice costs. One study estimated the total economic burden at over $1 trillion. Another put it at closer to $2 trillion. Communities have been destroyed. In some counties in West Virginia and Ohio, life expectancy has actually decreased, not because of disease or war, because of opioids. Entire generations have been lost. Children growing up without parents, families bankrupted by funeral costs and rehab bills that did not work. And the Sacklers, they are still rich, still living in their mansions, still collecting art. The only thing they lost was their reputation. Museums started removing the Sackler name from galleries. The Louvre, the Tate, the Guggenheim. Oxford University rejected a £1 million donation. It was too toxic to accept Sackler money. But they kept the billions. And nobody went to jail. The Sackler case is not just about one evil family. It is about a system. A system that allows corporations to kill people for profit and escape with fines that are tiny compared to the money they made. A system where regulatory agencies are run by people who used to work for the companies they are supposed to regulate. A system where bankruptcy law can be weaponized to protect billionaires from accountability. Start with the FDA. The Food and Drug Administration is supposed to protect Americans from dangerous drugs. It is supposed to review medications carefully, demand rigorous testing, reject drugs that are unsafe. But the FDA is underfunded and understaffed, and it is heavily influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. Here is how it works. Drug companies pay the FDA to review their products. This is called a user fee. The idea is that industry funding allows the FDA to hire more reviewers and speed up approvals. Sounds reasonable, but it creates a conflict of interest. The FDA's budget depends on pharmaceutical company fees. If the FDA rejects too many drugs, companies stop submitting them. The fees dry up, the FDA loses funding. This creates pressure to approve drugs, and the pressure is intense. FDA reviewers are evaluated based on how quickly they process applications, not how carefully, not how many dangerous drugs they catch. Speed. The faster a drug is approved, the better the reviewer's performance metrics. Curtis Wright, the FDA reviewer who approved OxyContin in 6 months, was not an anomaly. He was following the incentives, and when he left the FDA to work for Purdue, making 10 times his government salary, he was following an established pattern. According to a 2018 study, 40% of FDA medical reviewers go on to work for pharmaceutical companies within 10 years of leaving the agency. It is called the revolving door, and it is perfectly legal. Then, there is the medical profession. Doctors are supposed to be skeptical of pharmaceutical marketing. They are supposed to base prescribing decisions on evidence, not sales pitches. But the pharmaceutical industry spends billions influencing doctors. Free meals, conference trips, speaking fees, research grants. According to a 2019 analysis, pharmaceutical companies spent over $20 billion marketing to doctors in a single year. And it works. Studies have shown that doctors who receive payments from drug companies are more likely to prescribe those companies' drugs, even when the doctors claim the payments do not influence them, even when the payments are small. A $60 meal is enough to shift prescribing behavior. The human brain is wired to reciprocate. When someone gives you something, you feel obligated to give back. Pharmaceutical companies exploit this. Purdue took it to the extreme. They did not just pay doctors to prescribe OxyContin. They paid them to advocate for it, to give lectures, to write articles, to sit on advisory boards. They created an entire network of key opinion leaders, respected physicians who would publicly endorse OxyContin, and these endorsements were worth more than any advertisement. When a trusted doctor says a drug is safe, other doctors listen. One of Purdue's key opinion leaders was a doctor named Russell Portnoy. He was a pain management specialist at Beth Israel Medical Center in New York. In the 1990s, he was one of the most prominent advocates for using opioids to treat chronic pain. He gave hundreds of lectures. He published articles arguing that opioid addiction was rare in pain patients. He said that doctors' fears about prescribing opioids were unfounded. Portnoy received money from Purdue. Speaking fees, consulting fees, research funding. He did not hide this. It was disclosed in his publications, but the disclosure was in fine print, and most doctors did not connect the dots. They heard a respected expert saying opioids were safe. They trusted him. They prescribed OxyContin. In 2012, after the opioid epidemic was undeniable, Portnoy gave an interview where he admitted he had been wrong. He said, "Did I teach about pain management with the wrong information? Well, I think I did." He acknowledged that there was not good evidence supporting long-term opioid use for chronic pain, that he had been overly optimistic about safety, that he regretted the role he played, but the damage was done. Millions of prescriptions had been written. Hundreds of thousands of people were addicted. Thousands were dead. And Portnoy's apology did not bring them back. The medical journals were complicit too. The New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical publications in the world, published articles downplaying opioid addiction risk. In 1980, they published a short letter to the editor claiming that addiction was rare in hospitalized patients given opioids. This letter, which was not a study, just a 5-sentence observation, was cited over 600 times. It became one of the most influential pieces of evidence used to argue that opioids were safe. The author of that letter later said he never intended it to be used that way. It was about hospitalized patients under medical supervision, not chronic pain patients taking pills at home. But Purdue and other opioid manufacturers cited it constantly. And medical journals did not push back. They published industry-funded studies without sufficient scrutiny. They accepted advertising money from opioid makers. They were part of the ecosystem that enabled the epidemic. Then there is Congress. The legislative branch is supposed to protect the public, to pass laws regulating dangerous industries, to hold hearings and demand accountability. But Congress is bought. Pharmaceutical companies spend more on lobbying than any other industry, over $300 million per year. They employ more lobbyists than there are members of Congress. 2 lobbyists for every single senator and representative, and it pays off. In 2016, Congress passed a law called the Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act. It sounds good, right? Ensuring patient access. But what the law actually did was make it harder for the DEA to go after pharmaceutical companies and pharmacies that were distributing suspicious amounts of opioids. Before this law, the DEA could issue an immediate suspension order if they found a company was distributing drugs in a way that posed an imminent danger to public health. This was a powerful tool. It allowed the DEA to shut down pill mills and rogue pharmacies quickly. But the pharmaceutical industry lobbied to weaken it. They argued that the DEA was being too aggressive, that legitimate pain patients were being harmed. The 2016 law raised the standard for what qualified as an imminent danger. It made it almost impossible for the DEA to act. The agency's chief lawyer called it the worst law I've ever seen. But it passed unanimously. Every single member of Congress voted for it. Why? Because the pharmaceutical industry had spent years cultivating relationships, donating to campaigns, hiring former members of Congress as lobbyists, creating a network of influence that made opposition politically impossible. One of the lead sponsors of the bill was a congressman named Tom Marino from Pennsylvania. He received over $100,000 in campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies. After the law passed and the opioid epidemic worsened, investigative journalists exposed what had happened. There was public outrage. Marino withdrew his name from consideration for a position in the Trump administration. But the law stayed on the books, and the DEA's hands remained tied. This is how the system works. Industry money flows into politics. Politicians pass laws that protect industry. Regulators are weakened. The public suffers. And when people finally realize what happened, the damage is done and the money is gone. The Sacklers understood this system. They did not just exploit it. They perfected it. They gave millions to political campaigns. They funded think tanks and advocacy groups that pushed for pain management policies favoring opioid prescriptions. They hired former government officials as consultants and board members. They built relationships with universities and medical institutions that gave them credibility. And when the lawsuits came, they hired the best lawyers money could buy. Lawyers who specialized in bankruptcy, in asset protection, in negotiating settlements that minimized liability. They turned the legal system, which is supposed to deliver justice, into a tool for avoiding it. The bankruptcy process is a perfect example. Bankruptcy exists to give people and companies a fresh start when they are overwhelmed by debt. It is supposed to be a safety net. But wealthy individuals and corporations have learned to game it. They use it not because they are broke, but because it gives them leverage. When Purdue filed for bankruptcy, the Sacklers were not bankrupt. They had $11 billion, but by putting Purdue into bankruptcy, they froze all the lawsuits, forced everyone into a single negotiation. And then they offered a deal. Take our settlement or get nothing. Because if the bankruptcy failed, Purdue would be liquidated. The company had very few assets left. The Sacklers had already taken the money out, so victims had a choice. Accept $6 billion, spread among hundreds of thousands of claimants, or fight and possibly get nothing. Most chose to accept, not because it was fair, but because they needed something. Cities needed money for addiction treatment. States needed money for healthcare costs. Families needed something to bury their dead and move on. The Sacklers exploited that desperation, and the bankruptcy court went along with it. The judge approved the deal, even though it gave immunity to people who were not bankrupt, even though it violated the basic principle that you cannot discharge liability for intentional wrongdoing through bankruptcy. The judge said it was the best outcome available under the circumstances, that victims would get more money this way than through years of litigation. Maybe that is true, but it set a terrible precedent. It told every wealthy family and corporate executive, if you cause massive harm, extract the profits, and then put the company into bankruptcy, you can buy your way out. You can keep most of the money. You can avoid jail. You can escape justice. All you need is enough money to make a settlement offer that is big enough to tempt desperate victims, but small enough to keep you rich. This is not justice. This is a protection racket for the wealthy, and it is perfectly legal. As of 2024, the opioid epidemic continues. Fentanyl deaths are at an all-time high. Over 110,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2023. Most were opioid-related. The death toll keeps rising, and the Sacklers are still billionaires. The story of the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma is not ancient history. It is happening now. The consequences are still unfolding, and the worst part is that nothing fundamental has changed. The system that allowed this to happen is still in place. The incentives are the same. The regulatory capture is the same. The revolving door is spinning, And other pharmaceutical companies are watching. They learned from the Sacklers. They learned that you can make billions from an addictive drug, that you can market it aggressively even when you know it is killing people, that you can pay fines and settlements that are a fraction of your profits, that you can extract your wealth before the lawsuits hit, that you can use bankruptcy to shield yourself, and that if you are rich enough, you will never see the inside of a prison cell. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented fact. The evidence is in court records, in internal emails, in financial disclosures, in the bodies piled in morgues across America, 600,000 dead, and counting. Other companies are already applying the same playbook. Look at the manufacturers of fentanyl analogs. As law enforcement cracks down on one version, manufacturers tweak the chemical structure slightly. Create a new drug that is not technically illegal yet. Flood the market. Make millions. By the time regulators catch up and ban it, they have moved on to the next version. Rinse and repeat. Look at the pharmaceutical companies pushing new ADHD medications, stimulants that are chemically similar to methamphetamine. Marketed to children, prescribed at record rates. Are they addictive? The manufacturers say no. But they said the same thing about OxyContin. Are we going to believe them this time? Or will we look back in 20 years at another epidemic and ask how we let it happen again? Look at the makers of benzodiazepines, Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin. These are the modern Valium, highly addictive, prescribed for anxiety and insomnia, often in combination with opioids, which is extremely dangerous. Benzodiazepine-related deaths have quadrupled since 2000. But the drugs are still marketed aggressively, still prescribed freely, still making billions for manufacturers. The pattern is clear. Find a drug that people want, market it as safe, pay doctors to prescribe it, lobby regulators to approve it, make billions. When the deaths start, deny responsibility, blame the users, pay fines, use bankruptcy if necessary, keep the money. Move on to the next drug. This cycle will continue until we change the system. And changing the system requires changing the incentives. Right now, pharmaceutical companies make more money from addictive drugs than from cures. A patient who takes a pill every day for years is more profitable than a patient who is cured with a single treatment. Addiction is a business model. As long as that is true, companies will create addictive drugs. We need to eliminate the revolving door between industry and regulators. Make it illegal for FDA officials to work for pharmaceutical companies for at least 10 years after leaving the agency. Make it illegal for pharmaceutical executives to take government positions that regulate their former employers. Break the conflicts of interest that allow industry to capture the agencies that are supposed to regulate them. We need to ban pharmaceutical advertising to doctors. No more free meals, no more conference trips, no more speaking fees. Doctors should prescribe based on medical evidence, not marketing. Countries like France and Canada already ban many forms of pharmaceutical marketing. It works. Prescription rates for new drugs are lower. Generic prescriptions are higher. Healthcare costs are lower. We need to hold executives personally criminally liable for corporate crimes, not just the company. The individuals who made the decisions. Richard Sackler knew OxyContin was addictive and marketed it anyway. That is not a business mistake. That is a crime. He should have been prosecuted. He should be in prison. The fact that he is not tells every other pharmaceutical executive that they can get away with murder if they are rich enough. We need to close the bankruptcy loophole. Make it impossible for wealthy individuals to use corporate bankruptcy to shield personal wealth obtained through fraud or intentional harm. If you extract billions from a company you know is causing harm, that money should be clawed back. Every dollar, not a settlement, not a negotiation. Full disgorgement, and we need to treat addiction as a medical problem, not a criminal problem. The opioid epidemic was caused by doctors and pharmaceutical companies. But the people who got addicted are the ones who went to jail. Tens of thousands of Americans are in prison for drug possession, for using the drugs that Purdue marketed to them, that their doctors prescribed. Meanwhile, the Sacklers are free. That is insane. We are punishing the victims and protecting the perpetrators. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001. Instead of arresting users, they offer treatment, Drug-related deaths dropped. HIV infections dropped. Crime dropped. It worked. We could do the same. But we do not, because there is money in incarceration. Private prisons profit from drug offenders. Police departments get funding from drug seizures. Prosecutors build careers on drug convictions. The war on drugs is a jobs program for law enforcement, and the people who profit from it do not want it to end. The Sackler story is a story about power, about how wealth protects itself, about how systems are designed to let the rich escape accountability while the poor suffer consequences. It is about how American capitalism, without regulation and oversight, becomes a machine that kills people for profit. And it is not over. The Sacklers still have their billions. Purdue's bankruptcy plan is still being litigated. The deaths continue. Families are still burying children who started with a prescription and ended with a needle. Communities are still collapsing, and the next pharmaceutical scandal is already in the pipeline. What can you do? You can demand change. You can vote for politicians who refuse pharmaceutical money. You can support organizations fighting for drug policy reform. You can educate yourself and others about how the system works. You can refuse to accept the narrative that addiction is a personal failing. It is not. It is a crime committed against vulnerable people by powerful corporations. The Sacklers want you to forget. They want to fade into obscurity, to be remembered, if at all, as philanthropists who donated to museums. They want their names on buildings, not on tombstones. They want the story to be about addiction, not about the people who created the addicts. Do not let them. Remember their names: Richard Sackler, Mortimer Sackler, Raymond Sackler, Teresa Sackler, Beverly Sackler, Jonathan Sackler, Kathy Sackler, Eileen Sackler, David Sackler. Remember what they did. Remember the 600,000 dead Americans. Remember that they knew. Remember that they lied. Remember that they walked away billionaires. And remember that they are not the only ones. They are just the ones who got caught. There are other families, other companies, other fortunes built on suffering. The system that protected the Sacklers is still protecting them. But systems can change, laws can change, power can shift. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes people who care more about justice than convenience. People who refuse to accept that wealth equals immunity. People who understand that a society that does not hold the powerful accountable is not a society at all. It is a feudal state with better marketing. The Sackler family killed 500,000 Americans and kept $11 billion. That is not a controversial statement. It is a fact, documented in court records, admitted in settlements, proven by bodies in the ground. The only question is, what are you going to do about it? If you made it this far, you are not like most people. Most people do not want to know how the system really works. They do not want to hear that their government is captured by industry, that their doctors are influenced by marketing, that justice is for sale. They would rather believe in the myth that America is a meritocracy, that hard work is rewarded, that bad people get punished. You know better. You know that the game is rigged, that the rich write the rules, that the law protects property, not people. You know because you just spent 30 minutes watching the evidence. So what do you do with that knowledge? Do you shrug and move on? Do you tell yourself there is nothing you can do? That the system is too big to change? Or do you fight? Do you share this story? Do you demand accountability from the people you vote for? Do you refuse to let the Sacklers be forgotten? The choice is yours. But understand this: silence is complicity. Forgetting is forgiveness. And the powerful are counting on you to do both. Do not give them the satisfaction. Remember, share, demand justice. And the next time someone tells you that the system works, that bad people get punished, that America is the land of opportunity, show them this story. Show them the 600,000 bodies. Show them the $11 billion. Show them the Sacklers living in mansions while families bury their children. And ask them, is this the system you want to defend? Stay informed. Stay angry. And do not let them get away with it. Subscribe if you want more stories about the financial empires that control your life. Like if this made you realize how deep the corruption goes. Share if you think people deserve to know the truth. Because the next epidemic is already being planned. The next family is already extracting their billions. The next regulatory capture is already happening. And the only thing that stops them is you paying attention.